this idea is an expectation of violence, either against us or perpetrated by us. And that includes seeing us as a dying race. And some of the images I have up there from the film In the Land of the Headhunters, for example, and some of the anthropological images were taken because it was supposed to represent this kind of past-oriented dying people. So these ideas about us as violent subjects or subjects of violence help to legitimize state intervention into our lives and really dehumanizes us, so that there's only, when we see images of Indigenous people in the media, it often kind of feeds off and perpetuates these ideas. So we can see that representing Indians within racist colonial terms was central to the creation and imposition of a settler society. How we're seen has been shaped by the early anthropological movies I talked about, as well as newspapers, photographs, books, and so on, created by others, not by Indigenous people. And the representations we make and have always made of ourselves, such as through art and stories, have been dismissed as non-legitimate forms of knowledge or truth, unless validated by non-native experts. So this dynamic of delegitimizing Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people's experiences and worldviews lies at the heart of our struggles of representation today that I'm going to talk about. I have a couple images there, and I'll talk a little bit about that after, from the Paul Frank powwow party celebrating Fashion Night Out in New York City. So just wanted to sort of make the link between how the historical representations and then how today in kind of consumer culture, one of the other strategies is to make our cultural knowledge and symbols just something else that you can buy and kind of devoid of the original meaning that it has. So these ideas are prevalent in mainstream media's inclusion of Indigenous people, both ignoring us and problems that we actually want attention given to, and in how Indigenous people's lives are portrayed when they are included. So my work has been around violence for quite a long time, and when I was in my undergrad in the late 90s, I sort of was looking for coverage on violence in the lives of Indigenous communities, particularly girls and women, and just noticed there was really a lack of coverage, a lack of writing that had been done. And since that time, a lot of work has gone on into trying to gain recognition of the violence against us. But sort of what has that accomplished? What has that led to? So gaining recognition does take a lot of work, and there's been a lot of community efforts across the province and nationally to gain attention to, for example, violence against Indigenous girls and women. But even when visibility is achieved, there's limitations as to how that violence can be understood. So certainly the coverage of violence faced by girls and women, particularly in BC, has changed over the years. It's largely fleeting, and that fleeting nature is part of continued dehumanization, I would argue, so that it's just normalized now. You just see, girl goes missing, oh, another girl's dead. We hear about it for a day, and then you don't hear about it again. So the kind of uproar that happens when other kinds of violence takes place just doesn't happen. So we don't see a sustained interest, and it's just become part of how we see Indigenous girls and women is as subjects of violence, and that's just accepted. So there has been, as I said, a rise in visibility, particularly around the missing girls and women, both from Vancouver as well as in northern BC and nationally. So we have this language to talk about the missing women. We have images that come to mind around that. But what changes have really come from that? So in the case of northern BC, and just that whole area of the province largely remains out of the minds of most Canadians. In those communities, family members advocated for many years for attention to be given to the girls that were going missing, and did community marches and other things. And it was only when a tree planter, a non-native young woman, went missing that the public became aware of the fact that girls were being targeted in this area. So finally there was media coverage, media attention that was given. And so now they have the phrase the Highway of Tears to talk about Highway 16 in that area. So even though we now have that language and we have this awareness, we know that it's happening. When girls go missing and they continue to go missing and or are murdered on Vancouver Island, we had a couple girls just a few years ago, about a month apart. That again, it was in the media for a day, and then you just don't hear about it again. So even when that visibility is achieved, it doesn't really change how we understand the stories of Indigenous people's lives. The other example is in the case of, more recently in the news of Burns Lake, where, as some of you may have seen, where John Furlong was accused of physical abuse during his time working in that area. And despite the piece in the Georgia Strait that broke that story, it really just gave Furlong, in the end, an opportunity to rally people around him, to reinforce his credibility, and then it disappeared. So we haven't really heard anything about it since then. And I have that was one of the sort of images that we saw a lot of him, a lot of the coverage focused on him and how could people do this to him, and the kind of subject that he was, as opposed to hearing very much. We heard a little bit from some of the people in Burns Lake, but not very much. So what remains a challenge for us in making space for Indigenous people in the media, as I've been saying, is the ability to be fully humanized, given the normalization of violence that we face. So, and in the end, as people are fighting for visibility and for recognition of these issues, now that we have this language to talk about it, it really hasn't resulted in any changes in the level of violence, the acceptability of that violence, or really how violence as it happens is responded to now. Part of the impact of the coverage, I would argue, around a lot of the violence against girls and women has been that Indigenous women become marked by that violence instead of the perpetrators. So in the case of Pickton, for example, even though he was a white guy, it's not as though now all white guys are marked by that violence. It's the Indigenous women who continue to be marked either through their victimization or to be blamed for the violence they face. So it doesn't really end up making people more empathetic towards the women or changing how we see them or wanting to know about their full lives. It just sort of reinforces what people already think about them. So underlying all of this is that most representations of Indigenous people continue to deny our agency and voice. We continue to be understood not as Kwakwaka'wakw or Lekwungen or within our many nations, but more on terms of the sort of pan-Indian categories that have been imposed through colonialism in the first place. So making interventions to ensure our voices are heard take creativity and big, loud, insistent efforts, and we see things like blockades or other actions that are happening, for example, in northern BC in the pipeline resistance. I think that those actions do become visible in their way of reminding people that in BC the lands remain unceded, that there are very few treaties that have been signed, and that Indigenous communities are still thriving and living our traditions and our ways of life. But blockades don't happen for the kind of daily violence that's become accepted against girls and women. So in terms of strategies for making media space for Indigenous voices, and I'd like to just, I think, go back to that original idea I was talking about of indigeneity as place-based knowledge, forming a network across the lands that we live in. And that one way to gain visibility and create space in media is through asserting ourselves on our own terms. So magazines like Redwire and Spirit Magazine that are really focused on Indigenous communities, speaking to other Indigenous youth, other Indigenous communities, and defining for ourselves what our stories are, what's important to us, and how we want to tell those stories. And instead of trying to gain legitimacy and gain attention in mainstream media or to shape ourselves so that we fit into what other people are going to see as legitimate, to redefine that on our own terms. So part of that, I think, is there are programs in communities at a community level to do video projects with youth, to try to raise the capacity of youth to tell their own stories, and that people want to hear those stories. And that might not mean attention nationally or even provincially or within their town. It might be in their own small community that they're showing a video to local elders, to their family members, and that's where those conversations can start to be had about who we are, and to look at, a lot of the videos that are being made are around really pressing issues like violence, but they're done in a way that starts a conversation about how that's linked to historical issues, and not just focusing on the victimization, but on the bigger picture of how that fits into a lot of other community issues. So I think that there can also be a real broader impact felt from those efforts. And one of the cases, just going back to those images I showed from the Frank Paul powwow party, that some of you might have heard of more recently was when two Indigenous women, Adrienne Kay and Jessica Metcalf, who have blogs, Native Appropriations and Beyond Buckskin, they wrote letters and got attention through their blogs of the inappropriateness of the Fashion Week party, and that had a ripple effect of the president of the Paul Frank Company inviting them to speak with him and really taking action based on their recommendations. So they took all of the images of what that had like Native designs out of their catalog. They wanted the bloggers to meet with their sort of marketing board that they're a part of, and went much farther beyond just the readership that they had for their blogs, but was actually taken seriously within that company. And hopefully that'll have a larger effect as well. So I think we can encourage more of this, as I said, by raising the capacity of community members to tell their stories. And I think that the important thing, in my perspective, is going back to how we understand Indigenous people and communities, so that we are trying to restore an understanding of ourselves in a holistic kind of way, as whole people, not just the kind of sensationalist stuff that we see in the media. And that the conversations amongst Indigenous people is a good place to start. And I think, like Media Indigena, since I've been writing for them, it's been really fantastic to see that there's a large readership of Indigenous people online that are responding and having conversations, and other, non-Indigenous people as well. But that's not necessarily the focus. Not necessarily speaking in a language that's gonna get the attention of more mainstream audience, but that's going to foster more dialogue within our own communities. So I also have a poster there from Imaginative Film Festival, which just ended in Toronto, and that is an international Indigenous film festival that has been going for quite a number of years and has really fantastic programming. And yeah, so I think that's where I'll leave it for now until we have questions after. Thank you.
I prefer to sit, if that's okay, and I haven't, I've got a slideshow presentation as well, but it's not in order, so I'm going to just tell you to kind of jump all over the place. You can see the side slides, right? The icons.
No, it's kind of closed.
Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. Well, we'll struggle. Okay, so I'd like to start by also acknowledging we're on Coast Salish land, and that I'm in a long line of uninvited guests on this land, and I make the acknowledgement as a tiny step towards countering the denial of Canada as a settler state. My bio is in the program, but I just want to highlight I wear different hats in my work on media, and two are more relevant to my talk today. I facilitate Tricone Vancouver, which is a political and social unfunded organization representing about 145 South Asian lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgendered queers in the Lower Mainland. So my first hat is as a media spokesperson for Tricone Vancouver. And we're an immigrant population in the sense that all our members are seen as outsiders to Canada, whether we're immigrants, refugees, first, second, third or fourth generation Canadian. But we are, however, outsiders in Canada and migrants in that Canada is a settled land. What I sometimes call a neo-Europe on Indigenous land. The other hat I wear is as a journalist in alternative media, and Kinesis and Extra West are mentioned in the blurb in the program. Kinesis is Canada's national feminist newspaper, but I've also worked with this magazine, Pacific Current. I take photos for Vancouver Media Co-op and so on. And my scholarly work, I'm doing a PhD now, and of course it focuses on the relationship between alternative media and social movements. And it's from that experience that I derived my media literacy and analysis